Okay, Mrs. Lincoln, one last push, and we're done. 9 months and 4 days ago, a child was brought into this world, conceived in a humble shack in Kentucky, dedicated to the proposition that he would drink from a bottle and fill diapers for the next 2 to 3 years. Abraham Lincoln grew up with his relatively poor family in Kentucky, before eventually moving to Indiana and finally to Illinois. He read extensively, worked a variety of jobs, wrote some questionable poetry, and eventually entered the legal profession. Despite being entirely self-taught, he turned out to be a remarkably sharp and astute lawyer. In one notable case, a witness claimed he had seen a murder take place at night. Lincoln challenged him. How could he have seen anything in the dark? The witness replied that there had been a bright full moon. Lincoln then produced an almanac, proving the moon that night had actually been only a dim half crescent. The witness was exposed as a liar. Lincoln enters politics. Lincoln's talents weren't limited to the courtroom. He also entered the world of politics, serving as a legislator in both local and national assemblies. And what a time it was! Not even 100 years after the Founding Fathers declared that all men are created equal, politicians were already debating what exactly that meant. Add to that unresolved questions about states' rights versus the federal government and the limits of executive power, and it was clear that the Founding Fathers had left several critical questions dangerously open to interpretation. The biggest of those questions was slavery, an ugly stain on what should have been a revolutionary nation founded on liberty and democracy. Thomas Jefferson had originally included a condemnation of slavery in the Declaration of Independence, but it was removed out of fear of losing the support of the Southern states. Those unresolved tensions were now coming to a head. Verse: South, the growing divide. As the nation expanded, the North and South developed along two very different lines, with two distinct cultural identities emerging. Northern cities began rapidly industrializing. Meanwhile, the Southern climate was suited to large, labor-intensive plantations. As a result, the North did not rely on enslaved labor, while the South had become economically dependent on it. In 1793, Eli Whitney's invention of the cotton gin caused the slave trade in the South to explode, while in the North, an abolitionist movement was taking root. A deep mistrust developed between the two regions. Northerners feared the South was determined to expand slavery. Southerners feared the North wanted to abolish it entirely. The balance of power. And the compromises. In 1819, there were 11 free states and 11 slave states, a perfect if fragile balance. Then, Missouri applied for statehood as a slave state, threatening to tip the scales. The solution? Admit Maine as a free state simultaneously and draw a geographic line prohibiting slavery north of a certain boundary. The Missouri Compromise held for a while, but as America expanded westward, every new state or territory threatened to upset the balance once again. For a time, further compromises kept the peace. New slave and free states were added roughly in pairs. Then, Texas joined the Union, drawing the United States into a war with Mexico. Victory brought a vast new territory out west and new problems. California applied for statehood as a free state. More compromises followed. The issue of slavery was declared solved, and then, a few years later, it came up again. In 1854, an Illinois senator proposed organizing two new territories, Kansas and Nebraska, and allowing the settlers there to vote on whether to permit slavery, even though both territories lay north of the Missouri Compromise line. The result was chaos. Enormous numbers of pro- and anti-slavery settlers flooded into Kansas to influence the vote, and while there, they began fighting each other. Among those settlers was a man named John Brown, a former businessman who had failed at nearly everything he attempted and had become, by many accounts, a radical. He was a fervent abolitionist who had dedicated himself to the Underground Railroad and the cause of freedom. In retaliation for a pro-slavery raid, he and his sons killed several pro-slavery settlers, helping ignite years of violence that became known as Bleeding Kansas. Both Kansas and Nebraska ultimately voted to prohibit slavery, but the tensions had now reached a boiling point. In 1852, author Harriet Beecher Stowe published Uncle Tom's Cabin, a best-selling novel that exposed the brutal realities of slavery to the wider world. In 1854, the Republican Party was founded, and Abraham Lincoln emerged as one of its leading figures. In 1856, Massachusetts Senator Charles Sumner delivered a blistering speech on the Senate floor attacking pro-slavery Democrats and was beaten nearly to death with a metal-tipped cane by a congressman from South Carolina. Southern supporters sent the congressman replacement canes as tokens of admiration. On the floors of Congress, politicians began carrying weapons in self-defense. In 1857, the Supreme Court ruled in the Dred Scott case that all people of African descent, whether enslaved or free, could not be citizens and therefore had no right to sue for their freedom under any circumstances.